Hello, you're watching the Press Preview. It's our first look at what is on the front pages of tomorrow's papers, and checking out the headlines with me tonight, the journalist and broadcaster Lesley Riddoch, and also the writer Benedict Spence. Great to see you both. We'll chat in a moment after we've taken a look at those front pages for you. Starting on the Financial Times, reporting that Liz Truss and her government are poised to reverse many of the key decisions announced in the recent mini-budget. The Guardian's front page also reports on a possible mini-budget U-turn, as Liz Truss is said to have bowed to intense pressure from Tory MPs. While the Eye implies the timing is deliberate, with the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, attending a meeting of the International Monetary Fund in Washington. Here's tomorrow's Daily Telegraph, leading with the Chancellor's vow to fight on, insisting he is not going anywhere. While the Star compares the Prime Minister to a wet lettuce leaf. We'll explain why later, with the headline, "I am evil, I did this." The Metro reports on the trial of nurse Lucy Letby, who's accused of killing newborns in her care. On the Sun's front page, the referee, who's awarded Maradona's infamous Hand of God goal, is reportedly trying to sell the match ball for as much as £3 million. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us discussing them. And I'm joined tonight by Lesley Riddoch and Benedict Spence. Great to see you this evening. Thank you for joining us. Well, all the front pages pretty much have a theme, don't they? Let's have a look, first of all, at the Financial Times. A very important day tomorrow, of course. Lesley, what do you make of what's going on right now?
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? And the language there from the FT, I mean, this isn't just to abandon or put aside. This is ripping up the tax cut package. Even that headline tells you what actually you can read within the FT in its opinion columns, that there's really no way of ducking responsibility for this, no way of trying to kind of pass it off to anyone else. I see earlier you had comments from Ken Clark talking about it not being possible for Liz Truss to scapegoat Kwasi Kwarteng as being responsible for all of this. So it really feels as if there's been a political, fiscal, economic meltdown coming together to just place the current policy, and you'd think then the credibility of the government completely in tatters tonight.
Benedict, the credibility in tatters, if, as widely expected, we're going to see some U-turns. What are you hearing? What's your analysis?
Oh, it's pretty spectacular, quite how badly it's all gone. You know, a lot of people were saying that Liz Truss was, a candidate who divided opinion as to whether or not she would be sort of a bold, brand new sort of Iron Lady, or whether she would be a disaster. And it's not taken too long for us to find out what most of the markets think, and indeed what most of our own MPs think. I think actually the key thing on the front page of the Financial Times is a desperate bid to save premiership. I mean, what, 37, 38 days into this premiership and it's already on the ropes. And, we all know, of course, that we face, quite severe financial situation in this country. We do across most of the world. It's not just limited to this country, and that is in part due to the coronavirus pandemic, the war in Ukraine, many other factors. But, she has, thrown a match into this tinderbox ultimately. And, I think it sort of speaks ultimately to the weakness within the Conservative Party, that there isn't even the wherewithal actually to sort of back this candidate who most of them didn't want to be Prime Minister anyway. That whatever sort of spine there is gone. There is a realization that the top brass of the Tory party has been hollowed out. And if the question now is one about saving the premiership, well, as bad a situation as she's found herself in, ultimately U-turning on her sort of her banner headline policies, that is a recipe for disaster. That is a Prime Minister who is not long for this world. Can she save her premiership? I don't think that she can, if she presses ahead. But I certainly don't think she can if she decides to gut her own mini-budget.
Yeah, and The Guardian sums it up very well, doesn't it? Truss prepares new mini-budget U-turn in latest blow to authority. And Lesley, Benedict sort of hits a nail on the head there. I mean, if she U-turns and is seen as weak, how does she carry on running the country for the next 2 years? I mean, she's damned if she does U-turn and she's damned if she doesn't.
Well, that's true. I mean, I just wonder when we're going to get to the point that people feel that they don't want to see 170,000 Tory members being potentially asked again to decide, or just the Tory MPs, who will take over here. They don't want to see probably just another concoction of those folk who lost the last time suddenly being good enough to run the country. I mean, we need a general election. The Prime Minister should apologise, reverse the tax cuts and resign. And the fact that that's not finding its way into front pages yet seems quite astonishing to me, but I'll bet you it's going to start gathering next week.
Lesley, do you think part of the problem is that she punished all those members of the government who were backing Rishi Sunak? She sacked them, and now you've got the likes of Grant Shapps and Michael Gove sort of plotting from the sidelines. In a way, that was one of the big mistakes she made, wasn't it? That she wasn't trying to unify the party. She had the opposite effect.
Well, that's true, but I think we've now moved beyond, the sort of bruised feelings of people who had been marginalised within the whole election process. This is now quite an emergency, and for all the kind of game playing and the perhaps wry amusement that some people who didn't vote Tory and didn't back Liz Truss now feel watching the level of trouble that she's got herself into, she's got this country into a total meltdown. And there's pensions and mortgages and people's futures, all sorts of stuff is now hanging on how she manages to salvage her leadership. Whereas at the same time, I think people, quite rightly, it's strange, the markets have got this one right. You can't paste on credibility now. It needs a fresh start. OK, well, let's talk about Kwasi Kwarteng, Benedict. Front page of the Eye. PM plans tax cut U-turn while Kwarteng is out of the country. He is in America, as we know. Interesting hearing from our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who was saying that even this evening on the Treasury Twitter feed, loads of photos of Kwasi Kwarteng, the message seemingly being that he's not in a rush to come back to the UK on what is going to be a huge day for the economy.
Yeah, and I can entirely understand why he wouldn't be in a huge rush, because he doesn't want to carry the can for this. And I mean, it's very clear that the efforts are being made to sort of tar him with the brush, that ultimately he's responsible and that this is all his doing. But I don't think that that's going to fly. I think that if he goes down, the Prime Minister absolutely goes down with him. And I think it would be very desperate, therefore, to try to pass off a lot of the responsibility for this onto him. Ultimately, they are wedded ideologically in the same way. But of course, you can understand why Liz Truss will be wanting to pass the blame onto him, but equally why he doesn't want to necessarily step into the limelight at the exact moment that the U-turn has come. He was the man that delivered at the dispatch box the news that so rattled the markets. I can completely understand, for his own personal reasons, his own political ambition, why he wouldn't therefore want to put himself back into the firing line on behalf of somebody who ultimately, let's be very clear, is trying to throw him under the bus.
Yeah, similar theme, Lesley, on the front of the Telegraph. Kwarteng insists, I'm not going anywhere. But there is a rebellious mood, isn't there? As you hinted at earlier. I know we haven't got the Times in front of us, but we'll talk about that next hour, I'm sure. Maybe a Sunak Mordaunt ticket. Others perhaps see themselves in a role as well. What do you make of all those rumblings from the backbenches? Well, not surprising, but seemingly quite unprecedented. I mean, when you start, you just can't get past the superlatives now and the levels of kind of vitriol that are being communicated quite openly to all sorts of political correspondents, although, as the Truss supporters will point out, all of them anonymously. So, really, really swinging things being said about the government now. And all sorts of former advisors, people that used to be close, Liz Truss's former advisor, everyone now being wheeled out. And they were all wise now that this was a terrible idea. It does leave you speechless as to how we've gone through this whole process over the summer to arrive at really the quickest dud of a prime minister that this country has recently had. Let's finish with a look at the Daily Star then. Their headline, most urgent political question of the year, which wet lettuce will last longer? Book is offering odds of 6-1, Benedict, that a lettuce the Daily Star bought from Tesco for 60p will outlast Liz Truss as Prime Minister.
Well, that's delightful, isn't it? I mean, outlast in what sense? Are they very hungry in the Daily Star offices? Is somebody going to start munching on it? I mean, I understand the joke, obviously, but I mean, yeah, as was just being said there, we're hearing all of the sort of the sniping from the backbenchers and, anonymous briefings as to who it might be, who might come next, who might replace Liz Truss. Of course, hovering behind all of this is the dreadful, wicked spectre of Boris Johnson, who, I know that this might sound bizarre to a lot of people, but, given how bad things were under the Johnson administration, but I think an awful lot of Tory MPs will be looking at those days and thinking, my word, did we make the right decision, given how Truss?
Yeah, Lesley, I mean, there is even talk about potentially bringing back Theresa May or bringing back Boris Johnson. I mean, we're in a situation at the moment where nobody can predict what's around the corner.
Well, quite. I mean, I think if either of those eventualities come to pass, the Supreme Court's been sitting most of this week to look at whether the Scottish Parliament is able to hold a lawful independence referendum. You can bet your bottom dollar that either of those outcomes will stiffen resistance to the union in Scotland. So you can't just start to shuffle the kind of deck chairs on the Titanic. British democracy needs to regain some sense of credibility and not just keep shifting characters here. There's a wholesale reset needed for an outlook that's consistent, that the markets believe, that looks like it's credible, that people can buy into, and it's not anything that's going to be produced by the characters you've just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, even the head of the IMF giving a not very disguised rebuke to the Chancellor today. OK, thank you both for the moment. Stay where you are. Plenty more still to come, including the UK and France appear to be at loggerheads over whether a nuclear strike on Russia should remain an option. Discussing that and more after this short break. Part two of the press preview. With me now, Lesley Riddoch and Benedict Spence. There they are. Looking at the front page of the Daily Telegraph, Benedict, UK rebukes Macron for ruling out Russia nuclear strike, because we know, don't we, that the UK, the US, NATO as well have all been fairly ambiguous when it comes to what response they might use if Putin does decide to take the nuclear option. I mean, the problem is that diplomacy and language are so important, aren't they, when you're discussing the nuclear threat?
They are, and one of the running themes throughout this entire crisis has been Emmanuel Macron attempting to present himself, attempting to act as a go-between between Vladimir Putin, Volodymyr Zelensky, and the West, and it's not really worked, as everybody can see full well. The reason why this has kicked up such a fuss is Emmanuel Macron has said very explicitly that France's nuclear weapons would not be used in the conflict with Russia. He said that they wouldn't be used in a manner that would be counter to the interests of the French nation. And in doing so, he has slightly betrayed his hand. That's what Ben Wallace is saying, is that he's saying very explicitly, no, that we won't use our nuclear weapons, and that therefore gives Vladimir Putin some sort of incentive to ratchet up the tension in Ukraine and potentially to use nuclear weapons himself if he believes that NATO nations wouldn't be prepared to retaliate in kind. Now, let's be very clear here. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. There is, there's no sort of reciprocity there. And I don't believe actually that NATO nations would use nuclear weapons were the Russians to deploy them in Ukraine. But I do think that there would be a change in the nature of the conflict. It would provoke a military response from NATO nations targeting key Russian military infrastructure. And so you can understand, I think, therefore, why NATO, the US, the UK would be irritated with Emmanuel Macron, because they don't want to be getting into a sort of a tit for tat of saying what they will and won't do, what their red lines are and are not. Because, of course, we saw that in Syria with President Obama saying exactly what his red lines would be on the use of chemical weapons. They were then crossed and nothing was done in response. And I think that is the trap that NATO don't want to fall into on this occasion.
Yeah, I mean, the nuclear deterrent works until it doesn't. It tends to be the case, doesn't it? Do you think Macron has overstepped the mark here, made a mistake, Lesley?
Well, it's a strange one, because it seems as part of that interview that he had with French TV, he started off saying that the less was said in public, the better, and then went on to clarify this point about just absolutely not using the French nuclear deterrent if there was to be a strike by Russia. But there seems to be speculation that France is trying to kind of push for a different overall policy within Europe, to be more autonomous from the United States. And the thinking is that those comments will again have left most of his allies, the rest of the EU, looking at this and thinking, well, if that's not the kind of leadership that you want from France, then once again, that seems to make everyone feel they have to rely on the United States again. So it's a complex thing. He seems to have walked into the middle of. I kind of wonder whether he really intended to go that far or not. And it seems that other politicians in France have been quite shocked by the outspokenness of the comments.
Yeah, we've just got about 20 seconds to talk about this final story, Benedict. We'll do it more perhaps in the next hour. But gay football fans will be safe to show each other affection at Qatar's World Cup. Its chief organiser has been speaking exclusively to Sky News, the Metro covering it.
This was always going to be an issue when it came to a World Cup in a part of the world where homosexuality is illegal and where there are a lot of very severe cultural issues around it. I mean, it's one thing for authorities in a place like Qatar to say that fans will be free and won't be discriminated against by the authorities. But actually, I think that the key thing that is mentioned in the story here is that he says that he would like fans to be respectful of the culture that they walk into. And I think that's the key thing. It may well be that the authorities, the police, do not show sort of nastiness or crack down on fans, but the response that they get from locals might be very different. And I think that that's something that needs to be borne in mind.
OK. Thank you both. We'll speak again very shortly. Right now, we're going to take a quick look at the weather.